Winter 1863, in a New York courtroom where iron gall ink had bled through the docket, one word in the margin reframed a child's fate. Redeemed. The ledger lay bound with twine, its wax seals stamped flat by many hands. A clerk's careful script moved in straight lines until, at the edge of a routine entry, a second hand intruded, lighter, tentative, and fixed a label to a life. The city beyond that ledger had been pulled thin by war. New York had abolished slavery decades earlier, yet its warehouses and counting houses still lived on Southern cotton. The Fugitive Slave Act lingered like a threat, deputizing strangers to pry into black families' lives. Philanthropy and prejudice walked the same avenues. Prayer meetings shared blocks with riot rumors. On the first day of that year, the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect in rebelling regions, but its text did not steady a dockside where men spoke of conscription and profit in the same breath. Inside the courthouse, however, the law marked a narrower battlefield, whether a child who had crossed the Mason-Dixon line would be allowed to keep her freedom, her name, and her home. The files called her Fannie. The period's crude arithmetic would have labeled her 1/8 African by ancestry, terms set down in official reports and probate abstracts, not in any language a child chose for herself. She had been born in Virginia to an enslaved mother and a white father who never married. County files and wool books in the Tidewater recorded a practice both ordinary and fraught. A master who acknowledged children born to enslaved women, provided for them in his will, and promised manumission upon his death. In Virginia, the law added a severe postscript. Since 1806, any person freed by deed or testament was required to leave the Commonwealth within a set time or risk being forced back into bondage. Freedom, in that statute's design, often meant family separation by decree. Fannie's mother knew this. She was described in plantation papers as 1/4 African, a woman whose life could be measured by fractions on paper and yet whose choices refused to be small. She was married to another enslaved man. She had other children who were not named in any will and would not be free at the testator's death. To leave Virginia would have meant leaving them. In the absence of a workable remedy, she chose to remain. The law made that choice legible as staying enslaved. The files said no more, and did not need to say more to satisfy a statute. Fannie did not remain. Arrangements were made. The official reports are circumspect about how, and the child was sent to New York. A benevolence ledger in the North, if one reads the spidery ink in context, likely noted the receipt of one child. A doctor's note, typical of the era's travel requirements, may have attested to age and health, though no such paper survives in the packet. What the New York County records do confirm is that Fannie entered the household of a woman named Catherine Lawrence. The surname appears often in directories and church rolls. This Catherine's precise identity awaited better evidence. In private correspondence preserved by descendants, she was called simply Catherine, and Fannie was, or Fannie, a phrase that seemed both tender and tactical. New York had no adoption statute in 1863. Guardianship, private agreement, and habeas corpus were the instruments available to make a family legible to the state. The stakes were not theoretical. In a city that still honored the federal machinery of rendition, a child with Southern origins could be seized on a pretext if not shielded by paper and a household ready to stand in court. The question on the docket's line, the one later annotated with "redeemed," was basic in its phrasing and immense in its reach. Who held lawful custody of Fannie, and what was her status upon New York soil? On these points, the record clarifies and withholds in equal measure. Known's a will in Virginia intended to free certain women and their children upon the testator's death, accompanied by provisions for their support. Known Virginia's law required that the newly freed depart the state, a condition Fannie's mother did not meet because she would not abandon her husband and other children. Known, the child left Virginia and entered the household of Catherine Lawrence in New York, where a proceeding in 1863 recognized her status and placed her beyond the reach of those who might claim her. Known, too, from New York precedent, the Lemon case had established that persons held as slaves became free when brought voluntarily into New York. The climate of the law, if not its weather, favored Fannie. Missing, however, are the features that would make a historian's hand steadier. The exact docket number is absent from the surviving indexes. The transcript of the hearing, if one ever existed beyond the clerk's summary, has not been located. There is no sworn affidavit from the mother consenting to the child's removal, which would not have been required to satisfy a New York judge applying local policy, but would have answered a moral question that the law did not reach. The county files that remain include an entry in a clerk's ledger and a fee book notation, yet the judge's language appears only in paraphrase. The word, redeemed, set down by a second hand along the margin, is not a statutory term. It reads more like a moral ledger balance than a legal doctrine applied. The gap between those two vocabularies is where this story still draws breath. Against this backdrop, the core figures come into focus with a scholar's restraint. Fannie, not yet at an age to speak for herself in court, existed as a line item disciplined by other people's pens. Her mother, present at every moral turn and absent from every New York page, appears through the consequences of her choice. The father, unmarried but acknowledging his paternity in a will, provided a pathway that the law complicated and the war further obscured. Catherine Lawrence, in receiving the child and seeking a ruling, took on the risks and responsibilities of a guardian in a city that could be generous on Monday and hostile by Thursday. When the clerk wrote, redeemed, the hand did not explain itself. A later researcher, turning that page with care, would have seen the iron gall ink already oxidizing, its strokes sinking into the fibers. The term might have recorded a purchase that the court did not wish to describe. It might have summarized a declaratory judgment that, in plain English, declared Fannie free, redeemed from the condition that had ordered her birth. It might have been a clerk's private conscience intruding on public registry. The file does not say. The sealed records are not sealed so much as thinned by time, and the story we tell must admit where silence begins. Even so, the cold facts retain heat. In 1863, a New York judge wielded the quiet power to redefine a child's horizon. A woman in a Virginia quarter chose to remain where her marriage and other children rooted her, knowing that choice would be read by law as consent to her own continued bondage. A northern household opened its door and then opened a case. Between them, they carved out a future for one child, at a cost that the court did not calculate. The ledger closes its covers without ceremony. The city marched on toward a summer of violence. Fannie's name, secured in one jurisdiction, still faced the larger country's ambiguity. The margin note remains, a single word that suggests rescue without revealing method. Who wrote it, and why it was allowed to stand without explanation, are questions that the archive returns to the viewer. If this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell, and tell us what city and state you're listening from. The sequence is clearest when followed along the paper trail, not the road itself. 3 movements appear across, official reports, county files, and private notes, each one nudging the next. After the will was proved in Virginia, the estate chamber recorded what plantation memory already knew but law insisted on reducing to clauses. In the probate abstract, the testator acknowledged children born to enslaved women, named their mothers, and promised manumission at his death. The language was routine, almost mercantile. It was accompanied by the familiar warning embedded in Virginia statute: any person freed must leave the Commonwealth to retain freedom. In the margin of one copied abstract, an archivist's hand, much later, there is a faint notation, subject to removal requirement. It is not a contemporary clerk's phrase, yet it captures the narrow hallway the law provided. Why this mattered to Fannie is visible in the gaps. The abstracted will mentions issue. In general terms, names are unevenly carried forward. Incomparable entries of the era, some children are named, others are implied by reference to their mothers. Here, the mother's choice, to remain in Virginia with her husband and other children who were not freed by the will, created a conflict the statute did not soften. In later oral histories, a family voice recounted that she could not leave the little ones, but the county files do not record her words. A red flag appears even in this first movement, a rumored codicil, unlocated, said to clarify child placements. No copy is in the surviving county files, and no clerk's endorsement confirms it. The probate record closes with the estate settled to the executor's satisfaction. What it left unsettled was a life not easily divided by law. In the months that followed, arrangements gathered around the child rather than the mother. The trigger is not dated. The file suggests a period after the harvest, and before the roads became impassable. Travel from Virginia to the north often required papers, a note of identity, a physician's brief attestation of age and health, sometimes a letter of introduction from a minister or a merchant. In this case, no doctor's notes survive in the New York packet. Their absence is common, not proof of non-existence. What does surface is the receiving end. In a New York benevolence ledger, kept by a committee aligned with anti-slavery networks, a narrow line admits, one child received into care, placed in private household. The handwriting is compressed, the details spare by design. The surname is absent, the given name, Fannie, is later penciled above in a second hand, suggesting a clerk returned to complete the entry once the household placement stabilized. Why it was odd is the silence around consent. There is no mark attributed to the mother, no affidavit from Virginia authorizing removal. Legally, a New York court did not require maternal assent to recognize a person as free on New York soil. Morally, this silence troubles. A subtle red flag sits alongside the ledger entry. The child's age is rounded, not precise, and a blank where former residence would be written remains empty. The household into which Fannie entered belongs to a woman recorded in city directories as Catherine Lawrence. That name, common in the period, appears with multiple addresses. The official reports in New York County later refer to a Catherine L. without an initialed middle name, a practice that complicates modern certainty. Neighbors' recollections, collected decades later, describe a quiet girl in a gray shawl reading at a parlor window. This is memory speaking, not a sworn affidavit, and we mark it as such. Still, the convergence of ledger directory and neighborhood recollection allows a cautious picture. Fannie settled into Catherine's care as winter pressed in. The third movement unfolds at the courthouse counter. The exact day is missing. The docket sequence places the entry during a term when the court handled guardianships, writs of habeas corpus, and miscellaneous petitions to secure the status of persons vulnerable to seizure. A clerk's line notes a petition on behalf of a minor child, lately from Virginia, seeking recognition of free status in accordance with New York policy. The language harmonizes with the state's stance after the Lemon decision. It avoids naming the child a fugitive, a term freighted with federal machinery. Instead, it frames the issue as one of unlawful restraint avoided and lawful custody confirmed. Why this entry is odd becomes clear at the edge. In a lighter hand, maybe weeks later, someone adds a single word in the margin, redeemed. The court's order itself, summarized, not transcribed, states that the child is free and remains in the custody of Catherine L., without let or hindrance. No opposition is recorded. There is no sheriff's return indicating a claimant from Virginia appeared to contest. The petition appears to have been crafted so as not to invite a test of interstate comedy. It anchors the decision in New York public policy, keeps the frame narrow and closes. Witness voices do surface faintly even here. A neighbor remembered Catherine leaving early to the court and back by noon, returning with papers she put in a tin. A member of a friend's committee wrote in a meeting minute, later copied, that child was secured by law and placed under care, and that mother remains in bondage. The minute uses the vocabulary of the time with matter of fact finality. It neither condemns nor consoles, it records. Subtle red flags accumulate across these pages. The name line on the court ledger omits a surname, leaving the child as Fannie only. The address attached to Catherine is crossed out and replaced. Perhaps a move across town, perhaps a correction. A fee receipt listed under the clerk's accounts is initialed, but not fully signed. The hand is the same light script that wrote, redeemed, suggesting a single clerk handled both the annotation and the accounting. In the benevolence ledger, the entry receiving the child is flanked by two notations about transport with care, a phrase that's sometimes coded for quiet payments used to avoid attention. We cannot say this occurred here. We can say the proximity of phrases invites caution. Folklore attaches itself to such edges. One strand, preserved in a family letter written long after the war, claims that the child was bought out, and that redeemed was the honest word for a transaction made palatable. The official reports do not corroborate a purchase. No bill of sale appears. The New York court would have had no reason to set down the mechanics of a private redemption if its purpose was to declare and protect status under state policy. Another strand of community memory suggests that, because of her appearance and fractional ancestry, Fannie simply passed into a category that shielded her from scrutiny. The county files do not support this as a legal pathway. They do, however, reveal how threadbare the paper barrier could be between a declared status and a social perception. Between these movements, smaller artifacts sharpen the outline. A clipped editorial from a New York paper of the time reminds readers that the condition follows the mother, citing the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, then argues that New York's soil interrupts that logic. A sheriff's memorandum lists persons discharged from restraint. That term, a single initial, F, might be our file, or might be another. A photograph, undated, shows Catherine with a child whose face is turned slightly away. On the reverse, a pencil note reads only, or Fannie. The photograph's attribution is uncertain, we note it, but do not rest conclusions upon it. As escalation, this is a quiet kind, not a chase or a confrontation, but a sequence of paper acts designed to outrun the reach of a statute and the habits of a nation. Each step, probate, removal, placement, petition, substituted documentation for voice, and in so doing protected a child while obscuring the mother's part in the story. The files, assembled and handled in multiple hands, reflect both care and caution. Where they are most legible, they are most restrained. Where they ought to speak, on consent, on feeling, they keep a professional silence. The section closes, as the ledger does, with one unanswerable line. The docket for that term shows a blank space on the day after the entry. The bell of the court was said, by a janitor's recollection years later, to have rung twice that morning. No corresponding line appears. Whether that absence records a simple clerical gap or a decision not to memorialize a visit, the archive will not say. The investigation divides cleanly into two eras: the quiet, procedural inquiry of 1863 inside a New York courtroom, and the long, patient excavation by archivists and family historians a century and more later. Both move with restraint. Both meet the same silences. Then the work belonged to a judge at special term, a county clerk, and counsel aligned with anti-slavery networks. Their mandate was narrow. New York's public policy, sharpened by the Lemon decision, refused to recognize slavery within the state. Comedy towards slave law ended at the waterline of that principle. The petition on behalf of a minor child, lately from Virginia, asked not for a lecture on national wrongs, but for a declaratory shelter recognition that the child was free and confirmation that she lawfully remained in Catherine Lawrence's custody. In chambers, the judge's bench notes, if they were kept, do not survive in the packet. What we have is the clerk's abstract set down in the tidy, impersonal language of official reports. A sheriff's participation, if any, seems to have been administrative. In the term's memorandum of discharges, a single initial appears beside, released from restraint. The hand is small, the line unhelpful. No adverse claimant from Virginia is recorded, no warrant was returned, no confrontation made its way into the file. The court appears to have designed the order to be sufficient and ignorable, enough authority to fend off a seizure, too little provocation to draw a test case into open conflict. Around the court moved private actors with their own paper habits. A friends' committee, accustomed to relief work, kept minutes in iron gall ink that flaked as it aged. One entry, later copied, noted, "A child secured by law and placed under care," and, in a second line, "The mother remains in bondage." The phrase had the controlled sorrow of a minute book, it acknowledged without dramatizing. In other correspondence, kept in family trunks rather than county files, the word "redeemed" surfaces in a moral register, the way a congregation might speak of a life spared, not a statute applied. These private notes never claim to be the law, they color the margins of the legal text without rewriting it. Now, the investigation belongs to different hands. Archivists handle sealed records. With gloves and policies, some guardianship packets remain restricted, not by conspiracy but by routine privacy rules that favor the living over the curious. Genealogists read directories and tax lists the way some read novels, tracing names through address changes and marriage lines. Legal historians stand between these trades, translating docket habits into arguments about doctrine and practice. In this case, their inventory is plain. What exists? A Virginia probate abstract acknowledging children born to enslaved women and promising manumission at the master's death, a New York benevolence ledger recording the receipt of one child, and her placement in a private household, a New York clerk's entry declaring the child free and in Catherine L.'s lawful custody, without let or hindrance, a fee book notation that somebody paid for the paper to be filed, a meeting minute corroborating that a child was secured by law. These items align, they do not exhaust. What is missing? The full transcript or any settled statement of the judge's reasoning, the docket number that would anchor the entry to a bound volume beyond doubt, a maternal consent paper, any transport manifest or physician's certificate, the doctor's notes that sometimes rode with a child across state lines, any bill of sale that would convert moral vocabulary into a documented transaction. The absences are ordinary in 19th century cases, they are still absences. Chain of custody oddities are there, if you are trained to see them. The word redeemed, added in a lighter hand along the margin, suggests a clerk return to annotate or index. A page in the minute book bears a corner renumbered, as if a folio was once misfiled and later brought back into order. One envelope in the packet shows a broken seal resealed with later glue, the old wax flattened beneath. None of these marks contradict the court's action, each hints that the file was handled again after the day it was closed. Against this evidence, narratives strain. Rumor insists on a purchase, that funds were quietly raised, that someone bought out the child, and that, redeemed, tells the truth others would not write. Official explanation points to New York policy. Presence on free soil created a status the court merely recognized. Private notes use redeemed as a moral word that need not signify a bill of sale at all. Our work is to hold each story to its standard, documentation for facts, caution for speculation, and quarantine for folklore. Four theories present themselves with different weights. Theory A, New York recognition fact supported. The child resided in New York, a free state whose courts, after Lemon, would not uphold claims of property in persons brought within its jurisdiction. A petition, styled as guardianship or habeas, asked the court to declare what New York already presumed, the child as free. The order continued she remains in Catherine L.'s custody, without let or hindrance, language common in protective writs. No opposing party appears, no appeal followed. The Friends Minute corroborates the outcome. On this reading, redeemed is a clerk's moral gloss or an indexer's keyword, not a legal term of art. This theory sits closest to the paper we can touch. Theory B, private redemption quietly blessed, speculative but plausible. In some antebellum and wartime cases, anti-slavery networks raised subscriptions to purchase a person's freedom when no safer path existed. The benevolence ledger's flanking phrase, transport with care, sometimes coded for that work. The absence of a bill of sale does not disprove a transaction. Such papers often remained in private hands, or were never created when intermediaries feared legal entanglement. Under this theory, the court did not need to mention price or seller. It merely declared a status that private funds had made secure. It aligns with the moral use of redeemed in letters and minutes. It remains conjectural without a receipt, a letter naming a sum, or a donor list. Theory C, execution of the will across jurisdictions, partly supported, partly inferred. The Virginia will promised manumission at the testator's death. Virginia's 1806 law required departure to preserve freedom. The mother, married with other enslaved children, did not depart, the child did. If the executor treated the child as freed under the will contingent upon removal, then the child's presence in New York supplied the condition. New York's court, asked to recognize what the will had intended and the statute had conditioned, declared the child free. This theory fits the probate abstract and the New York order. It leans on an unlocated codicil rumored to clarify placements, a missing piece we cannot conjure. Theory D, folklore of passing as protection community story, not a legal mechanism. Later recollections suggest that, because of appearance and fractional ancestry, the child passed into a category that spared her scrutiny. The record neither uses racial descriptors nor requires them. Passing as a social practice could shape a life it did not by itself secure a court order. This theory explains community memory more than the docket and should be kept in that lane. Period framing tightens the lens. New York had no adoption statute in 1863. Judges relied on guardianship and habeas corpus to protect minors and free persons from unlawful restraint. Comity, the courtesy one jurisdiction owes another, yielded where New York's policy against slavery was engaged. The war cautioned officials against lighting interstate disputes over single households. Narrow orders were a form of prudence. Race taxonomies of the period, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, appeared in newspapers and doctors' descriptions. Their absence in this file spares us the vocabulary without changing what the law presumed status, followed the mother under Southern law, and evaporated on New York soil. What the record can assert is modest and solid. A Virginia will contemplated freedom for certain women and their children. Virginia law demanded departure. The mother remained. The child traveled north and entered Catherine Lawrence's household. A New York court in 1863 declared the child free and secured her custody in that home. Redeemed appears in the margin in a second hand. Where inference begins should be named and fenced. We do not know if private funds changed hands. We do not know if a codicil named the child. We do not know whether the mother consented, or how she understood consent when the only choice on offer required her to leave her other children. We can see hands in the archive, clerks, committee members, counsel moving the file forward. We cannot hear the one voice most implicated by the decision. So the investigation settles into its limits. The law's language explains the order. The moral language explains the word a clerk could not resist writing. Theories wander the distance between them. The safest ground is the least sensational, a free state court applying its policy, put paper around a child. The most haunting ground is the blank where the mother's words would go. The turning point did not come with a gavel's crack. It arrived as a folded folio slid across a bench, as a judge's pencil paused, as a clerk chose a word he was not required to write. Special term moved quickly on quiet matters. Petitions read in chambers were designed to leave shallow footprints, enough language to hold when tested, not enough to invite a contest. Counsel for Catherine Lawrence, his name not preserved in the county files, presented a narrow request, stitched to New York's own policy. The child, lately from Virginia, resided in Catherine's household. Under New York law, refined since Lemon, no person could be held as property on this soil. The order sought was not dramatic. It asked the court to declare the obvious and to protect the ordinary, that the child was free and that she remained where she was being kept and cared for, without let or hindrance. The judge faced the familiar pressures of 1863. Comity to sister states urged restraint. Public policy against slavery demanded declaration. The federal statute on fugitives still sat like a live wire across the docket, but this case did not touch it. The petition refused the word fugitive. It framed Fannie neither as escapee nor as chattel. It named her as child placed in a household and asked for a shield, not a banner. On the bench, decisions were shaped as much by what a judge declined to say as by what he wrote. He could have ordered a hearing with witnesses. He could have invited correspondence from the Virginia executor to clarify will and codicil. He could have penned a short opinion, bound into the official reports, boldly tying New York policy to the Emancipation Proclamation's promise. He did none of these. He chose the smallest instrument with the widest effect, a clerk's entry, a signature, and a directive that answered the question before him and avoided lighting a larger fire. Catherine, for her part, stepped into visibility. To secure custody in court, she accepted what the era required, perhaps a guardian's bond, perhaps sworn assurances of capacity, routine obligations that nonetheless placed her name on paper at a time when paper traveled. A neighbor's later recollection that she returned, before noon, with documents tucked into a tin speaks to the scale of the proceeding. Short, deliberate, real. The clerk wrote what needed writing. The entry line in the minute book recorded that the court found the child as free. It then fixed the place where law would meet daily life. The child would remain in Catherine L's custody, without let or hindrance. The phrase had a long pedigree in writ practice. It did not grandstand, it instructed. It told any officer, sheriff, marshal, or zealot with a badge that the court had already thought this through. And then the clerk, or a colleague returning to the file, did a smaller, quieter thing. In a lighter hand along the margin, neither part of the order nor contradicting it, he wrote a single word, redeemed. It was not a term of art in New York's chancery. It belonged to another vocabulary, one shared in meeting minutes and family letters. In official reports, redemption is what one does with a mortgage or a tax sale. Here it named a status beyond price, a life taken back from a system that had claimed it. Whether the word described a private transaction the court preferred not to memorialize, or whether it was simply a clerk's moral index to a legal fact, the packet does not say. The word stayed. The evidence pattern, scattered across jurisdictions, clicked into a map. In Virginia, a will promised freedom to certain women and their children at the testator's death. A statute there required departure to hold that freedom. The mother, married and tethered by children who were not to be freed, remained. The child traveled north. In New York, a benevolence ledger, kept by practiced hands, admitted one child received, and then in a later pencil, supplied her given name. At the courthouse, The judge's order and the clerk's summary sealed the matter within state lines. The Friends' meeting minute, copied with its usual restraint, confirmed that a child was secured by law. Each piece was modest. Together they formed a canopy. The stakes were not only legal, they were lived. New York was a city where sealed records did not necessarily seal a door. Kidnappers and vigilantes cited federal authority loosely and often. In July of that same year, mob violence would make clear how paper could become a fragile shield. The judge, who knew the mood of his streets, wrote an order intended to travel safely. No opinion for the newspapers. No rhetoric for pamphleteers. Just enough language for a constable's hand and a doorway argument. On another desk, separate decisions unfolded. The executor in Virginia, with his own ledger to balance, had already carried out the will's other clauses as the law allowed. If a codicil ever clarified the status of a child to be removed, it did not ride north. If a receipt ever recorded a private redemption, it stayed in private hands. The New York court did not need those papers to do its work. New York's policy made its own weather. But the absence of those attachments is what leaves today's researcher with more inference than quotation. There is, in the packet, a quiet echo of tension prudently avoided. A sheriff's memorandum for that term lists initials beside, released from restraint. One matches the child's first letter. No adversary appears in the line across from it. No writ of replevin. No demand letter from out of state. No request for continuance. If anyone in Virginia intended to test the order, they did not do it in that room. Perhaps the word of the will's intention, combined with the impossibility of the mother's departure, dissuaded challenge. Perhaps wartime cautions kept private actors close to home. The county files do not speculate. They record the outcome and move on. The turning point, then, is double a legal recognition and an archival residue. The judge's choice to write narrowly, free, and, without let or hindrance, turned a vulnerable biography into a protected one within New York. The clerk's decision to inscribe, redeemed, turned a protected status into a remembered story, a trace that later hands could find. Decades on, when an archivist lifted a misfiled folio and saw the lighter hand along the edge, the case sharpened in our sight. It did not change what had happened. It changed what could be said with confidence. From that day, the risk did not vanish, it altered. The greatest danger was no longer a constable at the door with a claim, but the city itself in its volatile seasons. A paper recognizing freedom could not instruct a mob. A household preparing supper could not be moved by citations from official reports. Catherine's choice to go on the record, to be legible to the state, was also a choice to keep those papers close, to be ready to present them in the street's courtroom if asked. The mystery sharpened rather than erased. Lives where the law's line meets the mother's choice. The court secured the child's future with a phrase. It could not write a remedy that would reunite a family divided by statute and geography. The word, redeemed, sits between those truths. It blesses an outcome. It covers an absence. It is finally the most human mark in a book of measured hands, and it is the pivot on which the rest of the file turns. The immediate aftermath was administrative, almost quiet enough to miss. The county files. Mark a fee paid. A clerk's hand drew a line through the docket entry to signal completion. A short notation, consistent with guardianship practice, suggested that Catherine Lawrence assumed formal responsibility. If a bond was required, its paper either did not survive or remains among sealed records, common to family matters of the era. No appeal was docketed. No sheriff's return showed an out-of-state claimant. The order did its work. It settled a child's status within New York. Directory entries trace the household in sparse, annual increments. In the city lists that followed, Catherine's address held steady for a time. A marginal mark, sometimes used for child, appears in one print run, then vanishes as children aged or clerks economized on type. Church rolls from nearby parishes record a pew rental in her name. They do not name the child. A friend's minute, copied later in the year, repeated its restrained line: "A child was secured by law and placed under care." The minute added nothing more. It did not presume to write reunion into the record. What the papers could not contain was the city itself. In July 1863, the draft riots ruptured New York streets. Contemporary newspapers, the Tribune, the Evening Post, the Anglo-African, carried reports of fires and attacks, including the burning of the colored orphan asylum. We note the context without drama. No document places Fannie or Catherine in those crowds. Relief Society, official reports, compiled after the riots, listed names of those aided with food, clothing, or temporary shelter. If Fannie's name was there, it has not surfaced. What the events demonstrated for households like Catherine's was the fragile nature of paper promises. A court's phrase, "without let or hindrance," could steady an officer's hand. It could not instruct a mob. In the months after, private families tucked court papers into tins and desk drawers, ready to produce them at a knock. South of the Mason-Dixon line, the law continued to tilt. The Emancipation Proclamation, already in force in rebelling regions, worked unevenly in counties under mixed control. For many enslaved people in Virginia, lawful freedom arrived in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. In that light, the mother's choice, recorded in files only as a consequence, stood in an even sharper light. She had refused the statute's narrow exit to avoid abandoning a husband and children the will did not name. The New York order protected her child. It did not ease the years that remained to her before the law would catch up to the moral arithmetic she had already done. We have no doctor's notes, no plantation diary, no letter bearing her voice from those years. The archive holds her by implication. In the quieter seasons that followed, the household resumed its ordinary tasks. A school roll from a ward near Catherine's address lists a F, with a mark for regular attendance. The surname line is blurred by time. A vaccination ledger from the later 1860s lists many children. None can be linked securely to this file. The city directories carry Catherine forward into the early 1870s. New York's first adoption statute arrived in 1873, giving judges at last a clear mechanism to formalize relationships that guardianship had sustained. Whether Catherine sought to convert guardianship into adoption under the new law is unknown. If she did, any resulting packet would likely be among sealed records by default. A search turns up no adoption docket clearly tied to this household. The absence proves little. In adoption history, silence is common. The official record, such as it is, ends as it began, with disciplined understatement. It declares that a child is free and fixes her in a specific care. It does not mark birthdays, holidays, or griefs. It does not record whether the mother and child saw one another again after 1863. The Friends Minute never amends its line. No addendum reports a reunion or a letter received across the lines. Post-war, the Freedmen's Bureau generated a storm of correspondence as families sought one another. Those classified memas and notices are rich in names and half-told stories. None, so far, have yielded a connection to this file. We say this plainly: the archive has not shown us their reunion. Community memory traveled a different road. Neighbors' recollections, collected decades later, remembered a quiet girl in a gray shawl at a window, then a young woman who wore her hair in a northern style. A family letter, written in the 1880s and saved in a box of recovered journals, made a brief, tender reference to "or redeemed child, now grown." The phrase shows how the margin note became a family word. It does not disclose more. Where memory strains to fill gaps, we mark it as memory. The long tail of the case reaches into law libraries more than into headlines. Scholars writing on race and status in the 19th century cite cases like Lemon for their doctrinal posture and files like Fannie's for their microhistory. The way families navigated law's narrow doors. The uncomfortable vocabulary of fractional ancestry, set down in official reports, medical descriptions, and court opinions of the time, has drawn careful study. Ariella J. Gross and others have shown how such labels operated less as biological measures than as social controls. In this file, those fractions are present in background, not foreground, a rarity that may say as much about New York clerks' habits as about a choice to spare a child the taxonomy. In archives, the packet that contains the minute book page with "redeemed" continues to travel. Requests to view it are logged. Researchers wear gloves, turn the page slowly, and let the lighter hand in the margin do its work. Some guardianship packets from the era remain closed, either lost to time or sealed by policy. As county digitization advances, small pieces surface: fee books, index cards, stray sheriff's memoranda that add edges without filling the center. The debate persists in footnotes, where conscientious writers separate proved fact from plausible conjecture and both from folklore. The legacy within New York law is modest and humane. The order stands as an example of how a free state court could use routine tools, habeas corpus, guardianship, to create a circumference of safety around a child while avoiding jurisdictional fireworks. It wears its virtue lightly. Its moral legacy is heavier to lift. The file embodies a model of protection that depended on removing a child from a mother because a statute had made family unity the price of freedom. That is not a judge's invention. It is the architecture of a system the judge sought, in a single instance, to relieve. For the family line, the word "redeemed" became an inheritance of its own. Later descendants who met the file in the reading room met themselves at the same time. Some carried away gratitude for the paper shield, some carried away sorrow for what the paper could never repair. Both responses fit the evidence. Stepping back, the case reveals three blind spots of its era that still whisper through ours. First, the authority of paper, the belief that a life could be secured by the right phrase, in the right book, signed by the right hand. Often it could. Sometimes it could not. Second, the economy of voice, who speaks in the record and who is spoken for. Here the clerks and the committee speak, the mother does not. Third, the comfort of narrow remedies, the court's choice to write small, to protect one child without provoking a war it could not win. The choice was wise. It was also incomplete. Official truth, as preserved in the county files, is not false. It is thin. It tells us what the court could do and did. It does not tell us what it felt like to watch a wagon take a child north, or to watch the door close on a winter afternoon with papers newly tucked into a tin. If this restraint chills, it does so properly. The record's silence is not a failure of craft. It is a representation of an era that measured some lives precisely and others only by their distance from the page. And yet, under the weight of time, the file remains legible. A judge's signature, a clerk's margin, a minute book's compassion kept within one unadorned sentence. These are small things. They were enough to move a child's horizon. The rest, what it cost, what it mended, what it left undone, belongs to a part of the story the archive cannot command and we must approach with care. In the end, the record holds its posture: a judge's narrow sentence, a clerk's single human word, and a silence where a mother's voice should be. Redeemed survives in the margin. The lives it touched move beyond the page. The case reminds us how official truth can protect and still leave the deepest costs uncounted. One question for you: which theory best fits the surviving evidence, and why? A straightforward New York recognition under free state policy, a private redemption quietly blessed by the court, or the will's manumission carried across jurisdictions when the child, but not her mother, crossed the state line? Choose one and tell us what detail in the file anchored your view. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell for the next case. Tell us your city and state in the comments, and what detail stayed with you: a margin word, a missing signature, or the decision to write small in a season of large violence. If this story should be heard by someone you know, share it. The sources and noted uncertainties are in the description for further reading. Next time, we open a different drawer, a sealed packet in a Midwestern courthouse, a photograph without a name, and a bridge that changed a verdict. We'll follow the paper, separate rumor from report, and see what the archive allows us to say, and where it refuses.